Hola, muy buenas a todos y bienvenidos a Cosas Militares. Hoy tenemos la suerte de tener con nosotros a Michael Kofman, una de las principales autoridades del mundo para hablar de las Fuerzas Armadas de Rusia. Forma parte del Centro de Análisis Navales de la Armada de los Estados Unidos y, por supuesto, del Centro del Carnegie Endowment for Peace, que tiene un programa completo para Rusia y Eurasia. So, thank you very much, Mr. Kofman, for being here with us today.
Yeah, happy to come back on your show. I think it's been quite a while since we
Yeah.
last had a discussion.
Yes. Before getting into detail on the offensive, I am very curious about what does Michael Kofman read when he has some free time. Do you have any kind of military history, another international actor that you like to read about usually on your free time?
Most of the time, I read military history or things related to strategy theory. I mean, right now, let's say I just came back from a trip. What's in my backpack is Dave Johnson, who is a very well-known Army historian. His book, I think, Fast Tanks, Heavy Bombers. It's a really great work. Unfortunately, Dave Johnson's not with us anymore, but I used to know him personally. So to me, usually it's things related to military history, or sometimes things that are kind of interdisciplinary outside of my immediate field, but I find to be very relevant and interesting. I'm not good at reading fiction. I know other folks will find this to be really boring. Like I find, in many cases, I find history to be more fascinating than fiction because a lot of things that happened you couldn't make up. So
All right. So thank you very much. So yeah, let's get into detail on the offensive.
sure.
So first of all, in your opinion, did the Ukrainians try a mechanized breakthrough at the beginning of the offensive? And if that's the case, why they stopped doing that kind of tactics?
Yeah. So the short answer is yes. The initial operation, the offensive, was a breaching attempt, and the breaching attempt was not successful. I think some folks initially interpreted this as sort of probing attack, reconnaissance, but that was not the case. And the reality is that the offensive operation, the way Ukraine approached it, right? There were some core assumptions in play on trying to set the conditions by having three axes of advance, having a supporting axis in Bakhmut, having another secondary axis pushing down from Yekina Vasilka, and then trying to see what could develop as the main axis. And all operations have assumptions that are built in, right? So there were probably some initial assumptions about the extent to which the Russian defense was prepared and the extent to which the Russian military was sufficiently motivated to hold those lines, right? And also what the performance of the new brigades would be, given their level of training, their familiarity with equipment, the amount of supporting equipment or enablers that they had. Okay, so the initial attempt wasn't successful. Ukrainian military adjusted. They then switched to tactics that primarily involved taking an attritional approach. That's not so much a strategy, right? I'm not a fan of a kind of dichotomy between attrition maneuver strategies, but thinking more of them as approaches or maybe emphasis, right, in how you're pursuing the campaign. So the Ukrainian military pursued an assault that combined dismounted infantry tactics, basically fighting tree line to tree line, slowly pressing the Russian forces, right, while trying to seek to establish an advantage in fires and also leveraging their advantage in long-range precision strike systems. In many areas, they were effective, but this essentially meant that this was going to be a grinding campaign, slowly pushing Russian forces. The Russian military reacted with an active defense. They were counterattacking and they deployed forward with a lot of their forces. And so much of the fight had been in that line of initial Russian defenses or sort of the security zone forward of the main defensive belts.
And how much time do you think that the Ukrainians can stay in the offensive? How many months? What do you expect on this regard?
Well, here's the truth. It's already been several months, and the reality of this approach also consumes a lot of artillery ammunition and a lot of personnel. I've heard it described as sort of a switch to preserve combat strength. The answer to that is yes and no. because it preserves combat strength from a standpoint of material. But I'm sure you appreciate that having dismounted infantry attack through minefields and under artillery fire doesn't actually preserve personnel, nor does an attritional approach preserve ammunition either. Actually, most of the time when you think of an attritional approach, the first thing that comes to mind is not necessarily force preservation unless you have very significant advantages. So the reality is that it's kind of a mix. And the truth about combat strength is that we don't really know what combat strength is remaining on the Ukrainian side, and we don't have a great gauge on the Russian side either. I'll get into that in a minute in the conversation. But at this point, it is fair to say that pretty much every brigade that one would have expected to have been allocated to this offensive has been involved in this offensive in some way, shape, or form, right? And the losses on both sides have been significant. So a lot of it depends on remaining ammunition, and that's a conversation about how much ammunition the United States and European countries will transfer to Ukraine. The DPICM decision was crucial in this regard because it extends the timelines for this offensive. But even though the United States is sitting on let's say, a relatively sizable stockpile of available DPICMs, although they're not all in the same categories of let's say, age of munitions and the performance you expect out of them, the thing is that these munitions are also meant to be a sort of a stopgap to be able to bridge sustaining the Ukrainian war effort until such time that Western artillery ammunition production sufficiently increases. So it's not just available for this offensive, right? It's meant to last for a longer period of time. And so the U.S. may end up rationing it. It depends how the United States actually transfers this ammunition to Ukraine. I hope this makes sense. There's a big difference between, let's say, giving 200, 300,000 shells per month, right, and giving 100,000 shells per month. It makes a significant difference in whether or not you have the ammunition for the offensive. Okay, best guess, I think the campaign in the South will probably go into September, maybe through September. It's a conversation where we have to split what's happening in the main offensive in the South versus the rest of the offensive in general. I don't know what's going to happen at Bakhmut, to be perfectly honest, and how that battle will unfold. But that's principally a supporting offensive. Its job was to draw Russian forces and fix them in Bakhmut. It's not an offensive with a very clear sort of strategic objective like the campaign in the South. So, but either way, I think this offensive is going to culminate in the fall, and I think earlier in the fall rather than later. Regarding the overall kind of campaign, that is to what extent Ukraine is going to retain the initiative, I probably think they will retain the initiative through the fall, although it's clear that's not going to be everywhere. The Russian counterattack at Crimea and towards Kupiansk also showed clearly that their intention is to try to take the initiative back whenever they can and to try to take advantage of anywhere where they sense opportunity. At this point, and I'll close on this comment, you see both sides are effectively employing reserves. The Russian military has thrown in airborne units and units from the Dnipro grouping of forces to plug in gaps and to try to relieve the heavy pressure on elements of the 58th Army. You've seen Ukrainian forces also throw in reserves, the air mobile brigades, 46th, 82nd. They basically come in to follow the second echelon forces. And there's going to be a question of who has more staying power at this stage. Both sides inherently face dilemmas, right? So for Ukraine to sustain the offensive, they may have to pull forces from other axes, for example, or pull some of the more experienced units or battalions that are fighting around Bakhmut. The Russian military also may find itself quite strained. So we're now in this period where we're going to see to what extent, what we have been for some weeks, to what extent the Russian military is really worn down and that their decision to fight forward, which is a pretty risky one, is going to be significantly detrimental. But the other challenge with this whole conversation is that Ukrainian military has been fighting for quite some time, and there's a big outstanding question on whether or not they have sufficient reserves to exploit any breakthrough that they're able to achieve, assuming there is a breakthrough, even at this stage.
There's a new question getting to my mind. Like, do you have the feeling that the Russians are there is a parallelism with the beginning of World War II in the sense of the Russians attacking a lot, like they do not preserve their forces as much as they could. They are constantly launching counterattacks everywhere in the whole front, and that really provides a lot of losses for them. Do you feel that the Russians have that that way of operating?
So the Russian military built out a defense in depth. They haven't been using it much. Part of the reason they haven't been using it is because they're clearly overconfident. They transferred forces over to Bakhmut. Like, they believe that they can handle the bulk of the Ukrainian offensive. And in fairness, for the last 2.5 months, they have managed to hold the line to the initial lines of defenses. If you look at the Ukrainian advance thus far, it's honestly not exceeded 10 kilometers in almost any direction you look at. And it's quite a ways away from any strategic objective. That said, the active defense the Russian military pursuing itself is also quite risky, right? Because it leaves them quite vulnerable to an attritional approach. And then the question becomes, to what extent is that defense brittle? I actually do believe that they have reserves of territorial regiments, basically territorial troop-based regiments and other units. And the big challenge that that you see from the way this offensive has unfolded is that it's slowly pressing the Russian forces back. It's pushing them back, but it's not really positioning for a breakthrough that can generate a momentum that will then impose dilemmas on the Russian forces. And so essentially, the Russian military is being pushed back into prepared lines steadily. You see the same in cases where they might face encirclement. They just retreat, like in Orozhaina this week, right? Once Ukrainians captured Starmayorsk next to it, it was clear that Russians were going to retreat from Orozhaina, take on the next line. So they're not being too foolhardy. They launch a counterattack here and there, but then they actually give up the position, try to avoid encirclement. From my point of view, the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's between, like, the Russians pursuing a doctrinal defense in depth. They built one out, but it's clear that they elected not to necessarily structure the defense that way, given how they saw the Ukrainian offensive unfolding. It's also not true that the Russian military is just defending forward. And once you break through these first initial lines, like, that's it. You can just drive through all the main defensive belts, and it's going to be open territory. There's no reserves. I think that's woeful. That's incredibly overly optimistic about what the situation looks like. And here's the thing. Folks have been optimistic in that way in the run-up to the offensive. And it's important that we learn from what's been happening in the last 2.5 months and say that's not how things have played out, right? That's the reality. That the more optimistic interpretations of the Russian defense have been proven incorrect, and that the Russian military has greater defensive capacity than was estimated going into this offensive.
All right. And what about the F-16s? Do you expect them to be able to change the strategic balance in the battlefield, as some people may expect?
Well, I mean, the problem with F-16s is, what are we talking about and what timeline? If you're thinking of F-16s the way that people typically think of in the United States, as a long-term transition program that will take several years to transfer a sufficient amount of platforms, train pilots to use them, get the maintainers, get the other supporting capacities in place so that Ukraine has sufficient numbers of F-16s, then in that regard, yeah, it can make a difference much further down the line. Yes, F-16s by themselves as a platform allow Ukraine to much easier use certain Western capabilities. You take your pick of missiles for different types of missions, sure. But by themselves, I mean, Yago, you know what I think here. I don't believe in silver bullets and game changers. I think this is a very superficial way to think about war, or to understand what's happening in a large-scale conventional war. And folks who have consistently looked for the next platform, the next system that's going to be a game changer, they've been proven wrong, and then they end up looking for the next game changer, right? And actually tell us something, right? If the last game changer, like Leopard 2 tanks or Bradley IVs or whatever it is you thought it was going to be, well, let's take Storm Shadows. So I've heard some folks argue that Ukraine has not been provided with long-range strike capabilities. That is not true. Ukraine has been provided with a substantial number of Storm Shadow and Scalp PG missiles. They've been using them for the past 3 months. I would say in some significant numbers, although we don't have the exact details. And folks are able to judge their impact. They've made a contribution, but have they dramatically changed the outcome or the course of this offensive? The answer is probably not, at least as best one can tell in the evidence. So this, again, takes us back to the conversation that all of these are contributing factors, but none of them are necessarily decisive. And most importantly, the conversation about F-16s needs to be very realistic on timelines. It needs to be very realistic of the fact that F-16s by themselves are not magical or talismanic, right? Especially not the ones that Ukraine is necessarily going to get. Older F-16s handed down by air forces that are trying to get out of them so you can get into F-35s, and they may not get them with a much, let's say, later generation AIM-120 missiles and what have you. It depends on a lot of factors, right? When people say F-16, my first immediate question is what block type, with what missiles, what's the radar that's going to be on it. I need to hear more, because an F-16 is not an F-16. There's a lot of nuances there. Last but not least, folks associate having Western aviation with having the effects that are typically achieved by the employment of U.S. air power, the capacity to attain air superiority and maintain it, right, over an integrated system of air defense and another, let's say, at least fourth-gen Air Force. Okay, but these effects have generally been achieved by the United States, by Israeli Air Force, by a few other air forces in particular contexts. By and large, this isn't something that you're going to attain with just a bunch of F-16s. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot that goes into the doctrinal adaptations, the organizational capacity you need to employ air power in this manner. And lastly, there's a great deal that goes into integration of air power and land power. If you're struggling integrating infantry, armor, and artillery, the core land combined arms, right, combat arms that you have on land, it's a much larger leap to go from that to integrating air power and land power, right? And I've heard some puzzling arguments in the past that, well, Ukraine is struggling with combat arms because they don't have air power. It's like, no, that's saying that it's hard to juggle 3 balls because you don't have 5. That's not the case. Okay, so if it's actually a lot easier to conduct combined arms maneuver when you're not trying to integrate air power as well into it. I'm not saying it's easier to succeed in it. It's much harder without air power and air superiority. I'm saying the actual job of coordinating an organizational capacity is much easier when air power is not in the mix. Once air power comes into the mix, it becomes even more complicated rather than less. Sorry, I go off on this rant because here's the thing. It just gets frustrating after a while to hear of F-16s or whatever the next platform is, as though it's going to be a magic carpet that solves this, right? Air superiority would make a big difference. That's true. Western country wouldn't have necessarily pursued this offensive without air superiority. That said, the Ukrainian military is structured around decisive employment of land-based fires. Non-military, they're structured around the strategic employment of air power, okay? And Western countries, particularly the United States, did their best to provide Ukraine with a significant advantage in long-range precision fires, with a relative advantage in tube artillery, with long-range precision strike systems of various types, maybe not to the extent that Ukraine wanted, but nonetheless, it would be unfair to say that this effort wasn't made and that Ukraine was not provided with advantages in this space.
All right, so I think we get time for just another 2 questions. One is, if Ukrainian offensive stays more or less as it is and ends in this same situation, what are the chances of negotiating a ceasefire on this autumn, on your opinion?
Oh, I don't think there's any chance of a ceasefire in the near future, and I wouldn't see something like that favorably to begin with. I don't see any Russian intention to negotiate, and I think a ceasefire would only likely lead to a rearmament period where we would just get a renewal of the war. This war itself is a continuation war of the 2014 war. We'd likely only get a third war from it. And most importantly, that conversation is very premature. The conditions, I think, just aren't there. And I don't see the basis for a ceasefire right now, given how mutually exclusive the Ukrainian positions and minimal war aims are relative to what the Russian position is.
Wow, so that brings us to another question. The production of artillery. Do you think that if the war lasts until 2024, 2025, the West will be able to outproduce Russia in this regard? Or what do you expect on this affair, we could say?
The honest answer is it's debatable. I think that production capacity is increasing in the West. Unfortunately, European countries started very late in this regard. And there were key decision points throughout this war that the United States and European countries could have made, but they were made fairly late, and they had, very important downstream effects as to why we are where we are right now in this conflict. I think looking out in 2024, 2025, yes, production capacity for artillery for certain types of munitions will increase. That's true, but it's also increasing on the Russian end as well. If you're looking at heading into 2024, there's a good chance that this year might be the worst year for Russian ammunition availability for artillery system, because production is increasing on their end. It's also increasing within the countries from whom they plan to buy, like Iran, right? And also increasing production of things like Lancet 3 munitions, long-range precision guided weapons, and other associated systems. I won't get into the details. I won't say things are good, particularly good on the Russian end, and that is their output is nowhere near what their demand is and where they would have hoped to have been in 2023. But nonetheless, it is visibly increasing. So Russian military is not going to run out of artillery ammo. It's been conserving and rationing artillery ammunition since the spring and through the summer. The big question is, will the United States and will European countries be in a position to provide Ukraine a sufficient relative advantage in artillery fires and enough set aside for another major offensive operation next year? That's an important question to consider, keeping in mind that a lot of the artillery ammunition for this offensive was in practice borrowed from South Korea. Right. Wow. So this is an important consideration, because not just about having the artillery ammunition to just sustain Ukraine's level of war. I think actually the West is in a much better position to sustain the Ukrainian war effort right now moving forward. The more important question is how they generate the capacity to provide a sufficient relative advantage for Ukraine for any future operations. So as to avoid this just becoming a hurting stalemate.
All right. So I get a final question, which is regarding the psychological domain. I feel that certain groups of fanatics who pretend to be supporting Ukraine are using pretty aggressive tactics at social media to attack any critic of the offensive. Do you have an opinion on how useful those people are for the Ukrainian cause and for the information environment?
Gee, sounds like you've been spending some time on Twitter. Gauging from that question. My advice is always to spend a bit less time on Twitter. As I tell folks, Twitter isn't real. Do real research and analysis, publish, and remember, Twitter rarely appears in the real meeting rooms where people make decisions. Okay, hate to disappoint folks. None of the meetings I've ever been in involve people reading other people's tweets as sort of advice on what to do regarding policy or strategy. All right, that said, I guess what I have to say is that, look, this is a war. It's natural for people to get emotional and to be involved, and plenty of folks have personal stakes, right? There'll always be issues when analysts interact online with activists or commentators whose primary goal might be more to boost or to support or to cheerlead, because our job is to be honest brokers, right? We are not neutral. I'm not neutral. I'm originally from Ukraine myself. I know a lot of these places. They matter to me. And often I don't say everything I necessarily know about a situation, right? Because it is a war, and I don't necessarily disclose everything or at the same time. But we have to inform public discourse and stick to the facts as we know them, and to also be equally honest about uncertainty and what we don't know. Okay. That said, look, in any crisis, people are going to emerge who are opportunistic commentators. Okay. Remember, during COVID-19, we found out that everybody turns out is an epidemiologist and has a secret medical degree online, right? But so these folks will emerge, and they'll often shroud themselves in the flag of the cause. But it's not about Ukraine to them. It's really about them. They are chasing influence, they are chasing fame, and they are chasing clout on social media. Whenever I've been in Ukraine, I go to Ukraine every couple of months, what I've always encountered is people there looking for genuine support, material assistance, objective analysis, and they like people in conversation to say how it is. And they want that support to be earnest. They're not looking for people who fetishize Ukraine, and especially do it for their own benefit, for their own standing. That said, at the end of the day, like I said, I'm not bothered by these folks. I know that they can create a toxic atmosphere online, and try to sort of take an absolutist approach where no matter what happens, they're going to rationalize that this is part of some secret, mystical, brilliant strategy, or that anybody who says anything that deviates from their preferences, that this person to them is unfairly criticized Ukraine. That's fine. The thing is, they don't set the conversation, and they don't set the discourse, and they're not the voices that are relevant or significant when it comes to folks who make decisions. So I guess I see my job as somebody who had become relatively senior in the field to show more junior analysts that you need to stick to the facts, you need to produce objective analysis, and you need to speak what you think, and you should not be afraid to admit when you're wrong, and basically pursue the conversation that way.
Well, so really thank you very, very much, Mr. Kofman, for sharing this afternoon in Spain, in this case, with us. Thank you very much, really.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Yager. It's good to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Bueno, pues muchas gracias a todos. Esta entrevista la doblaremos enseguida y bueno, espero que hayáis disfrutado tantísimo como yo de Michael Kofman. Muchas gracias a todos por estar ahí y hasta otra. Thank you very much, Mr. Kofman, again.